My guest today is Kate Quinn, New York Times bestselling author and an icon in the historical fiction space. Today, we talk about writing what you're drawn to and if and when marketability goes into that decision, the hero's journey versus the heroine's journey for character development and plotting, how to draw the line between fact and fiction when writing about real-life people or historical events, her advice for both aspiring writers and those who are a few books into their career, and so much more. I hope you enjoy the show. Hi, Kate. Welcome to Creative Inspired Happy. I am so thrilled to have you on the show.
I am so happy to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Well, I'm a big fan of your work, and I know that so many of our community members are too, because I always let them know about our podcast guests before they come on the show and ask if they have any questions. So we will get to that later. Their enthusiasm was wild. But I think, I want to start with the question that is at the forefront of most of our audience's minds, and that is, how did you become a writer? So if you could maybe kind of take us back into the process of did you always want to be a writer? How did you start? And how did you get to where you are today? Huge question, I know.
Well, it's the basic one though, isn't it? I really can't remember a time when I wasn't a reader or kind of formulating my own stories. I wrote my very first short story when I was 7 years old, and it's front and back of like a sheet of typing paper with pencil, unlined. And I wrote my very first book when I was 10. I had just learned how to type, and it's 121 double-spaced pages of pure awful that lives under the bed and will never come out or see the light of day, thank God. And even as bad as that book was, it really did teach me that this was what I loved. And so after that, I never was without a book that I was writing or working on. And so I was writing all through my teen years. I was writing all through my college years. At some point around the college time, I started querying literary agents on and off. And the way that would work would be I would write a book, and then I would look through literary marketplace to see all the agents who were representing historical fiction. And I would work very hard in a query letter, and I would mail it off to them because, yes, it was snail mail in those days. And then they would all tell me no. And then I would think, well, I guess I better write a better book. So I would write another book, and I'd try to make it better. And then I would send those rounds of queries out to whoever was now representing historical fiction, and then they would all tell me no. And that was pretty much a rinse and repeat all through my entire college years when I was at Boston University studying music, ironically. And eventually the no's started to get more positive, and it's like, not quite for me, but really this is pretty good, keep at it, that kind of thing. It can be very encouraging when all you've heard is just no, form rejection. So eventually, around the time I was out of grad school, I was doing auditions. I was working as like an administrative assistant for some horrible office space like spot, to pay the bills. And that is when I ended up getting a literary agent for the novel that I had actually written my freshman year of college when I first arrived in Boston and been trying to escape a Boston winter as a Southern California girl. And that book, after a whole lot of polishing and cutting, ended up getting sold about 9 months later and coming out, I think, a year and a half after that. And that was my very first novel, Mistress of Rome. So that's really sort of the how it happened of it all.
Did you always know you wanted to do historical fiction? Because it sounds like even in college, you were writing and querying historical fiction.
I tried a number of different things. I have probably 11, 12, maybe more novels under the bed. So, I did try my hand at other things. I tried a YA novel. It was terrible. I tried a mystery. It really just proved that I can't write mysteries. I tried, I think, sort of a light-hearted rom-com kind of thing, and that didn't really work either. But I kept gravitating back toward historical fiction because that was sort of my first love. My mother was not only a librarian, but she had a degree in ancient and medieval history. So I was learning about history in the kind of casual way that, other kids my age were, watching Saturday morning cartoons. And that is, what really was fascinating me at an early age. It is what I read myself. I read a lot of historical fiction as a kid and as a teenager, and that over and over tended to be where I gravitated when it came time to write stories of my own. I think you really can't pick what fascinates you in terms of what stories make you light up. I mean, I will read almost anything in terms of genre, but something about stories in the past is that's the thing that hooks me every time. And I remember a good quote from Stephen King. He said something like, I spent a lot of my career, probably too much of it, being, vaguely ashamed of what I write. Various well-meaning people telling me, Stevie, you have talent. Why do you write such trash? And he just said, I can't help it. I have a love of the active graveyard and the unquiet coffin, and that's all there is to it. And I always loved that quote because, it is very true. I think every writer has, gets their light bulb turned on by something completely different. And for me, it happens to be stories in the past.
And do you think about like the marketing or where it goes on the shelf, or like, is this story that I'm choosing to write now, this is going to be something that is going to have a bigger audience or a smaller audience? Does that go into your story choice at all? Or are you really kind of pursuing that spark?
Well, I think when you are just doing writing as a hobby, as a passion, then you can, just write the book of your heart, whatever it is. When you turn it into a career, as I have been very fortunate to be able to do, and then you have to start worrying about things like, how am I going to pay my mortgage with this? That is when you do have to take market considerations into your calculation of, what you're going to write next. I don't think you can, treat it completely coolly and just write something that, it's like, I don't care about this topic, but it will sell, because that's going to come through in your writing. If you're going to be spending, a couple of years with researching and writing and editing a novel, you'd better enjoy the process of it. It has to be a project of passion. But I will say, I do look, now for that Venn diagram overlap between what it is that I feel passionate about writing, and then what it is that the market wants, and that my editor wants, and that readers seem to want. And you look for that overlap, and that is, that is something that definitely does factor in. But fortunately, I'm interested in so many different historical periods, so many different fascinating, things that have happened in the past, so many great women who have done amazing things in times past, that I don't think I'm ever going to run out of ideas. And, the nice thing about trends in the market is that they come and go all the time. So even if you think like, okay, I can't write this book right now, it doesn't mean that you never will write it. It just means that I'm going to tuck that idea back in the bank for later. And, I have had that happen, plenty of books, ideas where its time came a little later than I thought, but I did still end up getting to write it.
Oh, I love that. It's so reassuring, I think, to anyone who has a lot of ideas but doesn't know which to pursue. Or sometimes, you spend, like you said, so many years working on something and then it feels like it's not going to go anywhere. So I love the idea of tucking it away for the future. Okay, I want to talk about this year. You had a big year this year. You had two books come out this year. One was The Phoenix Crown, which you co-authored with Janie Chang, and then also you had your own solo written book, the Briar Club. So I would love to start with The Phoenix Crown and talk a little bit about, like, tell us about what it's about, and then let's go into the co-authoring experience.
The Phoenix Crown, well, it actually was one of those ideas that I've had for a long time, and then it didn't come around in the way that I was anticipating. And I'd had this idea, some years ago, I wanted to write about the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, and that's what the Phoenix Crown is about. It is about two very different women, one a New York City opera singer, and the other a resourceful Chinatown seamstress, who are thrown together in the chaos and bloodshed and panic of the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. And this originally came to me in a slightly different form, as I was thinking of it as a solo novel, but I ended up pulling some of the ideas out of it and using them in another book instead. A heroine that I liked, and then ended up in another book. And then I realized this San Francisco idea had a big hole in it. And the more I looked at that history, the more I was thinking, I think what would really make it, the best book that it could be was, it needs a Chinatown heroine. It absolutely did. I mean, because that history of Chinatown is so vibrant, so central to the history of San Francisco. And that I was thinking, it's like, is that something though that I can write authentically? And I had my doubts there. But I am very, very good friends with the lovely Janie Chang, who, if you're watching and you haven't picked up her books, The Porcelain Moon, The Library of Legends, Dragon Springs Road, you're really missing out. She's such a wonderful writer. And so I sort of tentatively called her up and I floated this idea. It's like, what do you think? Is this history that would interest you? Because again, she has to feel just as strongly about it as I do if we're going to work on it. And she, did some thinking about, like, okay, what could a heroine in Chinatown in San Francisco be? Would that be a woman I would enjoy writing? And, she said yes. So we really approached it from that angle, is that, I would create my heroine and she would create her heroine, and we'd throw these two very different women together and add an earthquake and stir. And that's pretty much what we did.
I love that. So I'm curious what your process was for working together because I've talked to other co-authors before. I've also co-authored a book. I mean, everyone has a different approach. Is it shared Google Doc or is it like getting on video calls or how do you deal with revisions? Like, what was your process?
The Google Doc and the Google spreadsheet really were two things that were integral in the writing of this particular book. We did a lot of plotting and outlining, and we did that because we had quite a tight deadline. And if as you've co-authored, if you have a co-author, you really can't afford to go down garden paths and end up with a plot line that has to be scrapped when you're possibly wasting someone else's time as well as your own. So we really needed to keep ourselves on track. And so we did a lot of plotting together. We were probably in the room physically together, 4, 5, 6 times, something like that. We lived a couple of hours apart at the time. I was in Washington State and Janie was in Vancouver. And so we got together in like a hotel room and, unlimited coffee and snacks, or we got together in my living room and just pulled up that Google Doc and that spreadsheet, and we had everything on that spreadsheet. It was, because we determined already that we wanted to do alternating chapters where I would write all the chapters from my heroine's perspective. That's the opera singer named Gemma, and Janie would write all the chapters from Su Ling's perspective. That is the Chinatown seamstress. And we did that because we weren't sure about creating a blended style. We had quite different styles from each other. And so we thought this would keep it clean, and that way we just need to alternate. I have the odds, she has the evens. But that meant that we needed to dovetail how these chapters went together. And that worked in the way that for every chapter, we had it outlined like how much time passes, where does this start, where does it end, generally what happens within the chapter. And that way we could write somewhat independently from each other. And because we knew we would know, generally speaking, what is going to come before your chapter and what is going to come after. And then we would do some dovetailing once we had seen, what was coming before. And the way we did that was as soon as we were done with our rough drafts of each chapter, that would go up into a shared Google Drive, and then the other person would read it. And that's very vulnerable to start because, it's like, I don't know about you, but it's like, I would rather be seen in my underwear by strangers than let people see like my very unedited, very rough drafts. And that can be very self-conscious to know that someone else, of course, someone you admire too, whose work you love, is going to be, seeing your rough drafts. But you get over that. And it really was exciting because I would start getting the feel of, it's like, I can't wait to finish this chapter so I can throw it up there and so Janie can read it, and then I will see what she does with the next bit. And it started to feel like we were sort of standing on opposite sides of the fence, like throwing pieces of the story back and forth to each other. And that really was fun.
That's fair. That's so collaborative. I love that. And so, even though you had the whole story mapped out in terms of chapter by chapter, you were still doing it chronologically, and then you could play off of each other and your energy and how the previous chapter ended.
Yeah, and we did a lot of collaborating along the way. Like, if someone got stuck, it would be, okay, I don't think this, what we originally planned for this chapter is going to work. And we would hop on Zoom and we would crowdsource an answer. And, the nice thing about having a collaborative partner is that two heads really are better than one. If you're trying to solve your own book problems, that can sometimes just feel like you're banging your head against a wall. But if I could hop on Zoom with Janie and we would just, throw ideas back and forth, and in no time we have a solution to the problem that is probably better than anything that either one of us could have come up with individually.
Was it tricky trying to revise someone else who is such a well-established author as well? Because I feel like even among critique partners, it's a little bit tricky how you deliver feedback. But at least with critique, when it's your own book, you can take or leave whatever they say. But when you're working together on a project that has to come together, there's that balance you have to walk between like respecting their ideas and not pushing too hard on yours, but also trying to make this entire book as good as it could possibly be.
Well, we approach this with a great deal of respect and for each other's work, and also a certain degree of caution because we both heard the horror stories of, like writers who work together and by the end they're not friends. So we were aiming to produce a book that we were proud of and that people would love, but most of all, we wanted not to destroy a lovely friendship in the process. So, and I've done, some collaboration works before, so I had some idea of where the pitfalls were, and you do have to be careful in the way that you deliver your criticism and so forth. But the way that we approached it was, like we never red penned freely on each other's work. Like you would make suggestions, comment bubbles in the side where it might be something like, I feel like the pace is slowing here. Maybe let's speed it up a little bit and thin out some of the details. Or someone would say, I just don't think that, my heroine would react in this way. Let's amp up the emotional response. And then it would be up to the other person to implement those changes, and rather than the co-author just going in and making the changes on their words themselves, because it was our book, but it was my chapters and her chapters, and we always respected that. And we were especially careful in the way that we depicted each other's heroines, because Gemma was very much my heroine, and Janie and Su Ling was Janie's heroine. And then therefore, when the two women interacted in each other's chapters, like if Janie is writing, lines of dialogue for Gemma in hers, or if I'm writing lines of dialogue for Su Ling in mine, I might just put in brackets something like, I'd like Su Ling to say something like this, but you go ahead and fill it in what you think she'd say and how you think she'd say it, because you know her better than I do. Or, Janie might rough in some dialogue for Gemma and just say, in the margin, feel free to change this up if you don't think it sounds right. And so therefore we made sure that, especially when it came to our separate heroines, that we gave the other author a free hand in making sure that the heroines sounded like themselves and acted like themselves, even in each other's chapters. So that way it was as consistent as possible. And that really did make sure we had a very conflict-free writing and pleasant writing process. It was so much fun. And we did not have like serious disagreements about anything in writing it. Like, we had places where we weren't sure what to do, and then we would, come together and, like, figure out what needed to happen. Or if we thought like, well, how do we handle this critique from our editor? Like, I'm not sure she's right about this, so what do we propose instead? And then we always would figure out a way together to make it happen.
That sounds like one of those books that kind of like it was the right time and it was the right way to do it. And as you'd mentioned, you had played with this idea for a long time before on your own, and this kind of was magical and came together. So I'm so happy that that book worked out, and that it came into being kind of like maybe as you had really hoped and dreamed that it would be. I want to talk a little bit now about, you're mentioning heroines and making sure that they come across the way that you want them. And I want to tie this into talking about the Briar Club a little bit. So one thing that it seems consistent in most or many of your books is that you always have women fighting for themselves. And then there's often an emphasis on the strength and the importance of friendship. And so I'm wondering if you write these themes on purpose or if it kind of comes out. And also if you could talk a little bit about the Briar Club and how that's part of that story, or not, but I think it is.
Oh no, absolutely. It continues to fascinate me, like women, and the way they work together, unlikely women becoming friends, unlikely women supporting each other, because, women supporting women is something that I believe in so passionately. I have so many great women friends and colleagues in my life that I would, without them, I'd be in a padded room somewhere. And, that's therefore a theme that I do return to over and over in my books, because, it continues to fascinate me. And I think that women, especially when they're pulling together, can do, truly amazing things. Like, this is a little bit of a divergence, but not too much, I promise. That we all have the idea of the hero's journey. And, like you talk, like a lot of your audience is writers, right?
Yes.
We have, the idea of the hero's journey, but I'm not sure if you knew, because I didn't know for a long time, that there's also the heroine's journey. And this doesn't apply to gender. It can apply to, you can have a man who has a heroine's journey in a book, or vice versa. But a hero's journey typically involves the lone hero standing alone at the end to face that final fight. That's how the hero's journey ends. And that's typically what we know. But a heroine's journey, even though it has a lot of the same beats, the heroine's journey usually involves the hero or the heroine using their connections, their people, their loved ones, and creating a network that will get the job done. And I love that idea. And that's often what I like to play with, is that you have not just one woman standing alone, although that can also be a great story, but you have women who use their connections to other women to do something truly extraordinary. And I think that, in real life, women working together can do truly extraordinary things.
Oh, I love that. And so how did you build that into the Briar Club? And tell us a little bit about that book.
Well, the Briar Club is about a boarding house for ladies of good character only, who are which is set in Washington D.C. in the early 1950s, and group of very different women live under that roof, and they really have nothing in common except an address until the final boarder finally comes to stay in the attic room at the top of the house. She's a somewhat enigmatic widow from Iowa who doesn't say a lot about her own past, but who is very good at community and very good at pulling all of her unlikely neighbors together into something a little closer and more friendly than they've ever had before. And except the thing, of course, is that all of these women have varying levels of secrets, and there is going to be one, explosive day, Thanksgiving of 1954, when some of those secrets come home to roost, and a body ends up on the floor, and then the women have to decide who is the real enemy in their midst and what are they going to do about it. And it is really a story about community building, and women relying on each other, and how that works at, even when the stakes are extremely high in early 1950s, Cold War paranoid, McCarthy paranoid America.
Oh my gosh, that sounds so fascinating. I think this is kind of a perfect seg to our community questions. So, Creative Inspired Happy is not only a podcast, it's also a community of writers and curious readers. And so, I always let my audience know ahead of time who our podcast guests are, and they have a chance to ask questions. And everyone was so excited that you were going to be on the show. So, I have 4 questions for you today. And the first one is from Smriti R. And she says, I have always wondered how good writers traverse that tricky path between facts and fiction. How do you decide when to stay true to history and when to make something up? And she's asking it to understand what makes a compelling story and how you think about this.
Well, the thing is that if you're writing historical fiction, it depends, first of all, very much where you're working in the historical record. For something like the Briar Club, that is a very well documented period of history, because there's literally newspaper databases that I can search to find things. And that is great because you have a lot of material to work with, a lot of historical fact, but you also have more that you can get wrong, which is where the pitfall is. I've also worked as far back as, ancient Rome, and in that case, you might only have 3 surviving sources that document your entire period that you're writing about. And if it's not there, and if you have some huge historical gap in the record, then you've got to fill that gap somehow. So you're going to have to use your imagination, and you're going to have to extrapolate what the likely outcome be, and you hope for the best. So it depends on how much of a gap in the record do you have, and you try to plug those gaps as well as you can. But even when you have a lot of material to work with, you always have to keep in mind that just because a source says something doesn't mean that that source is not biased or wrong. In fact, there's no such thing as an unbiased source. So you also have to keep that into consideration. It's like not only what is being said, but what isn't being said, and what is, the unconscious bias, or, the things that might tweak the truth of what actually happened. So when it comes to trying to form your story around that, you plug those gaps however you can that you have in the record. You try to figure out the places where something might be wrong or just unreliable. And then you try to think, it's like, well, what are the things that you can afford to change for the sake of a story? For example, in the Briar Club, it's like I changed the date slightly on a baking contest, because it's a baking contest. It was something that is in the record, but it's not huge. It's not a huge historical event. However, I am not going to change, for the sake of the story, the date when the Korean War kicks off. That is a beat too far, and people will think you just got it wrong. So it's a matter of, little things you can tweak for the story, and, you keep a list of those and you fess up in the author's note, which is something I always do. But, you have to you don't move the big tent poles of history, or, if you're talking about real people, you don't try not to play too fast and loose with what their characters are, because especially if you're working in the recent past, these people may have, they may still be alive. They may have children who are still living. You're talking about personal family history, if you're for some folks, if you are playing in the recent past. So these are all things that you keep into consideration. And sometimes it ends up you're calling your friend and your critique partner and saying, do you think I can get away with changing X for the sake of the story? And if they have a very strong, ooh, don't do that, then you'll end up thinking, all right, well, I got to find another solution now.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And just my question as a follow-up, how do you resist the temptation to dump all of your historical research into your book and kind of overwhelm the reader with all this really cool stuff you discovered you may possibly at the expense of the story?
That's the balancing point, and you generally find that out after your first draft, because in your first draft you do put in way too much, probably at least if you're me. And then that's when my critique partners will tell me gently, I know you put a lot of research into this. I know that hours went into you figuring out all the building details behind the building of Hadrian's Wall, but nobody cares this much about plaster and gravel. You've got to cut it down. You do not need 14 pages on the building process. You need 2. So cut it down now. That's when you like end up thinking, but I spent a lot of time on that. It's really fascinating. I know, but it's getting in the way of the story. It brings your story to a dead halt. You can't use it. And I'm just, all right, fine, 2 pages. I can cut it down.
I mean, I think that's helpful. That's great advice to get an outside eye on that.
The
It's hard to
outside eye
know
will
otherwise.
usually tell you where your research is showing a little too much.
Yeah, yeah, I get that. Okay, our next community question is from Diana W., and it is actually about one of your other books, Diamond Eye. And Diana says, I would love to know how you discovered the Russian sniper's story, Mila, and how much research goes into developing a complex character such as this one, like how much of Mila's relationship with Eleanor Roosevelt was based in fact.
For that one, it actually was a little easier because I found Mila's story when I was researching some of the women for the previous book of mine, The Huntress, because The Huntress is about the all-female regiment of bomber pilots who flew against Hitler's Eastern Front. And when you're researching one set of Soviet war heroines, another, more of them tend to cross your feed, tend to, crop up in the same research volumes. So that's how I found the story of Lyudmila Pavlichenko, aka Lady Death. And she had this incredible, larger than life, stature and story. And she really was friends with Eleanor Roosevelt. And all of that was so incredible that I thought, she won't fit in this book, but I've got to write about her later. So I literally just tucked her in my back pocket for later. And then, like 2 books down the line, I ended up thinking, okay, I think her time has come. I really want to write her. And so I was very lucky in regards to her because the real Lyudmila Pavlichenko wrote her memoir. And so I did have her own life in her own words. And that helped tremendously in giving some of the details about what was that visit to Washington, D.C. like, those conversations with Eleanor Roosevelt, a lot of them I picked right from her memoir. And a lot of the, great things like, taking a canoe out when she was a guest at the Roosevelt estate in upstate New York and, falling into the lake and Eleanor, scolding her and, bringing her inside to change and like hemming up a pair of pajamas that she could wear because Eleanor was very tall and Mila was a little thing. The 2 of them talking away and, the president literally coming in to, figure out where his wife has disappeared to for lunch. That all came from Mila's memoir and that was great. But on the other hand, again, talking about how sources can be unreliable, I had to keep in mind that this memoir was published under a Soviet regime. And there were certain things that the censors would not have allowed her to say or would have encouraged her to say in retrospect. Like there's a very flattering cameo of Stalin in her memoir. Mm-hmm. And the indication from the research is that she actually did not have this meeting with him, but because no one else mentioned it and they would have, but the censors are like, we would like it if you would insert a flattering portrait of the boss, please, in your memoir, which is sure to be a bestseller. And the only thing that you say if you're living in a Soviet police state is, yes, I will do that. Thank you very much. So I had to keep in mind, where were the places where propaganda was putting its stamp, and you can see it there. You just have to sort of like weave your way around it. So that was a way of doing things. And then there were other places, just because it was a memoir, where she did not necessarily include the whole story. And that's because none of us do when we're telling our own stories. I mean, I had in my book, my version of her life, the character of her ex-husband looms large. And the thing is, in her memoir, he has about 3 lines. And the thing is, I know why he has about 3 lines in her memoir, because he was a louse. And because if you're writing the story of your life, which you're hoping to highlight, all the cool things that happened and the things you did that you were proud of, how much time are you going to spend on, a lousy ex? None. You're not going to give him any page time because he got too much page time in your actual life. And you don't want him taking up room in the story that you're leaving for posterity. So I know why she left that out. And it's the thing is, he would have loomed large in her actual life. So I had to guess at, well, how do I think he did change her life, and where could I put him in, and what's the likely story there, or at least a likely story, because we don't know what the real thing is. So that's an example of like how you fill those gaps, how you create a character, and then how do you get around the things that they're saying and the things that they aren't saying, and use that to create something that at least could be true.
Oh, that's fascinating. Oh my gosh. I just want to hang out with you when you're doing your research and all that stuff you cut out. I will read it. Just send it to me. Okay, we have a question from Danica B. And she says, you've written about different time periods. What pulls you into a particular time and place? And, or like, put another way, what is it that sparks a story for you?
Generally speaking, for me, because I've written about any number of different historical time periods, and the thing that I figured out is that there are certain themes that continue to fascinate me, which can exist in any number of historical time periods. And overall, really, the overwhelming thing is that I am fascinated by the ways in which women of the past carve out these little spheres of influence or independence when they live in times that do not want them to have it. And the thing is, you can find women like that in almost any historical period. So this is why I have jumped around to, ancient Rome and Renaissance Italy and Gilded Age San Francisco, and World War I, World War II, the Cold War. I've jumped around because women like that can be found in any era, and that's the kind of story that always lights me up.
Okay, that's a perfect answer for our last question from the audience. So Christine C says, I love the Alice Network. I read it for research on how feminine skills, not just sex, can persuade powerful men. And she was doing this during a project on corporate stakeholders and climate change. So she said, I'd like to ask if you have any other research suggestions for this niche, i.e., how could feminine skills be deployed for a secret corporate mission today?
I think the thing is, and I just came back from a fabulous conference in LA called the Shine Away Conference, which is hosted by Reese Witherspoon, the Reese Witherspoon Book Club, and her company Hello Sunshine. And it's a conference to uplift women, centering women, and how women succeed in business and in writing, in entertainment, in athletics, in almost any field you can imagine. And I heard a great story there where one woman, it was Sarah Blakely, who is the entrepreneur behind Spanx. We all own a pair, so you can imagine how successful she is. And she said when she made it big with Spanx, like she had a bunch of men who told her, well, Sarah, you should know business is war. Get ready for the battle. And she ended up thinking, why? Why is business war? Why do we have to work that way? I don't want to work that way. And it really came down to, it's like, well, men have created a great many of these fields which are male dominated, and they have created the rules by which those run. But does that mean that we always have to play by the same rules? I don't think it does. I think a lot of women have succeeded very well by, again, heroine's journey, utilizing their network, utilizing their gift for networking, their gift for community, their gift for pulling in the people around them, and using all the resources they have on hand rather than seeing everybody else as a threat or as competition. And it doesn't mean you have to get all kumbaya about it and this has to be all soft and maternal. You can be hard driving and ambitious, and you can have ruthless goals, and God knows for climate change, we need it. But you can have these ideas, but you don't have to have the idea that it's you against the world. It can be the idea of use the people around you, use your own skills that women tend to develop for networking, for pulling in, for relying on a community. Use those skills and apply them to the other places in life besides just, family, or, keeping that family calendar, updated with 12 different people's, set, schedules on it. All these things that we end up doing just because they're the normal part of a woman's life, use them in other fields and other spheres of influence as well. There's no reason why we can't, and there's no reason why those things can't help us succeed. For the women of the Alice Network, the thing I kept finding was that, women were effective in espionage because they could so often be underestimated. They used that ability to be underestimated, and people paid for that if they underestimated these women, but often they didn't even realize they were paying. And they used their skill at passing unnoticed. They used their skills at relying on the women around them. They used the fact that women were so often considered to have attention to detail and to be detail oriented. That was something that the women code breakers were great at, and it came down to using everything you had. And I think that's still something today, that just because you have a skill at one thing doesn't mean it can't be applied somewhere else. I
Yeah,
hope that answers the
I
question.
think it was a great answer. And I recently listened to a podcast and I can't remember what it was, but they talked about how these skills that were traditionally coded as like feminine, like asking more gently or putting it as a suggestion rather than an ask, those in the past we'd been advised that, oh, if you want to succeed in business, like that's bad. You have to like be more straightforward, you have to like charge in like a bull. And this new study shows that that's wrong, that actually those kind of natural ways of speaking that we've been told, don't do this, you're being too soft, they work, and it is just a different way of approaching things and a different way to achieve success. um,
I love
so I
that.
just have a couple more questions for you. One is going to be advice for aspiring writers, maybe 2 points of advice for aspiring writers, and then also advice for writers who are maybe like, a couple books into their career, since you've been doing this now for almost 15 years. And then we'll end with book recommendations from you.
Well, I would say for aspiring writers, the main thing to keep in mind, at least to start, is that you need to give yourself permission to be bad. And the reason for that is because I see so many first time writers who get really intimidated by that little voice in your head that says, this is terrible. You can never show this to anybody. What made you think you would write a book? And then they get so intimidated by that they never finish. And if you don't finish a book, if you don't finish a story, if you don't have a finished product to work with, you will never get anywhere. So you need to silence that voice by whatever means necessary. You need to give yourself permission to be bad, to say, you know what, this first draft is going to be terrible, but it's okay. Because the fact is, and this is a line that's been attributed to everyone from Nora Roberts to Jodi Picoult, but it's true, is that you can fix a bad page, but you can't fix a blank page. So silence the voice, give yourself permission to be bad, just hammer out that really terrible rough draft, because once you've got it down, you can fix it, I promise. So that's the main thing I would give advice wise for starting out writers. And for writers who are a few books in, I think the thing to remember is that this a writing career is a marathon rather than a sprint, and it's also a roller coaster. Things are not a smooth upward trajectory or a flat line. There are gonna be highs and there are gonna be lows, and you are going to have to be adaptable and to have the ability to pivot when you hit those lows and you realize, okay, well, I tried something that didn't work. So for the next book, what am I going to try to pivot in a more interesting or useful or lucrative direction? The ability to be adaptable and to change, because so that you can handle the highs and the lows, I think is absolutely key to a long-term writing career.
Fantastic. Thank you. And then you are also a huge reader. So let us know, what are some books that you recommend? And obviously yours at the top of the list, but what would you recommend that aren't yours?
Well, some books that I read lately that I really loved. Lauren E. Rico's Familia, fabulous story about a woman who finds out that she has a sister in Puerto Rico who she never knew, and these two women getting to know each other with very, very, very different agendas. Really great. I loved an ARC for a book coming out next year by Victoria Christopher Murray called Harlem Rhapsody, all about the Harlem Renaissance, and this fabulous woman who was right at the heart of it, who nurtured so many great Black American writers right at the start of their careers. It was great. I just read also Liz Moore's The God of the Woods, which is just a fabulously twisty mystery about a very rich family in the 1970s that runs this summer camp, and then the daughter of the family goes missing, and what secrets that brings out into the light. So those are just three that I read recently that I can really recommend.
Amazing. Adding them to my TBR immediately. This is great because we're going into the holiday season where people are going to start making wish lists. So thank you for that.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. That's my entire wish list. It's just books.
Oh yeah, mine too. It's always a great time to bulk up your library.
Definitely. Okay, if people want to find you online, where can they find you?
For finding me online, you can find me on Facebook. My author page is just Kate Quinn Author. I'm on Instagram. It is Kate Quinn 5975, and you can also, find me just katequinnauthor.com. That's my website, and you can subscribe to my newsletter. I only send about 3 or 4 a year, so you will not be inundated. But if you do, like, you get some fun free stuff. Like, you get right away you get a free short story that I wrote that is set in the world of the Alice Network called Call Me Alice, and so you'll get that just as a free, fun bonus freebie just for signing up for my website. If you don't find it in your inbox immediately after signing up, check your junk file. It does sometimes end up there the first time, but. So those are 3 places where you can keep up on all my stuff.
Oh, fantastic. I'll include all those in the episode notes with links in case anyone wants to find you. Thank you so much, Kate. This was amazing, and I learned so much.
Well, thank you again for having me. This is a great discussion.
Want more writing advice and career insight? Join thousands for free at creativeinspiredhappy.com to go behind the scenes with best-selling authors and get access to our book club for writers, creativity challenges, and more. I can't wait to see you there.